I recently asked a Zimbabwean if he knew David Coltart, and he said that this guy has a long history of standing up for that which is just, which is a wonderful compliment. When I looked up David Coltart, I noticed that this guy has a CV that's longer than the Old Testament, but what I got is this. He wrote this book, 50 Years of Tyranny. And what's interesting about this book is that he criticizes the Ian Smith regime as well. It's a very comprehensive book on what's happened in Zimbabwe for the last 50 years. And when he criticizes Ian Smith, he dispels the nostalgia around the white Rhodesia. But then his story continues, and in the early 1980s, he reported on the human rights abuses in the Gukurahundi. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah.
And that started his long opposition with Robert Mugabe. He later became the Minister of Education, Sports, Arts and Culture, which is no small portfolio. And I like to say that David Coltart was a social justice activist before it was trendy and cool to be a social justice activist. Apparently he survived assassination attempts on his life. He's got 4 children, 1 wife. So with that massive introduction, David, welcome and thank you for being here.
Well, thanks, Johan. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So David, you're on a speaking tour in South Africa, and we're basically asking the question what we can learn from Zimbabwe, from the last 50 years in Zimbabwe, especially as South Africa is currently wrestling with the land issue itself. So I would like to focus specifically on that specific question. So I guess my first question to you would be this. When we think of the land issue in Zimbabwe, we've got these images of the land grabs in the early 2000s. But that didn't happen in a vacuum. So I'm interested to hear from you, what's the backstory in terms of, these are the images we saw. We saw the documentary Mugabe and the White African, but what is the backstory behind all of that?
Well, the backstory is that it was a crisis deferred at independence. When Zimbabwe got its independence from Britain in 1980, the issue of land, in effect, was kicked into touch for a while. Mm. And in many ways, a lot of white farmers themselves were lulled into a false sense of security. Mugabe and ZANU-PF needed white commercial farmers to stabilize the country and in particular the economy. And they had this sort of false honeymoon period of almost 2 decades where the land issue continued to fester and the historically unjust patterns of land ownership that were present at independence were still present 20 years after independence. And the blame for that, I think, lies mainly with Mugabe, but also with white farmers themselves, in that Mugabe didn't develop the financial systems and, for example, training of a new cadre of black commercial farmers to take over land, and kept land in reserve as a sort of populist measure to dive into his piggy bank, his political piggy bank, when he was in trouble. And so to that extent, he was to blame by suddenly rushing an issue which had been present for 2 decades. And likewise, white commercial farmers lulled themselves into a false sense of security. In the 1990s, when the land issue started to be debated in Zimbabwe, kept saying to many of my clients in my lawyer's relationship with them, make yourself indispensable. Don't go on a holiday to Mauritius. Build better housing, build better clinics for your farmers, for your farm laborers. Don't think that this issue is simply going to go away. And unfortunately, many just disregarded that advice. But in that, I think there is a key to South Africa's land issue.
In what way?
Well, I think that we must learn that white South Africans need to understand that the current land holdings in South Africa are unsustainable. They're based on historical injustices, and to that extent they have to change. The question is, how are they going to change? And is there going to be a spirit of collaboration between the government and white commercial farmers in this country? But also, there will be less pressure on white commercial farmers in this country if they do address, for example, some of these issues. What is the standard of education on white-owned farms in this country? What is the standard of health and housing? And what we found in Zimbabwe is that many of the white commercial farmers who are still there, well, actually, no, many is an exaggeration. Some is more accurate. But some who are still there are there because surrounding communities actually supported them, and their own labor forces supported them because they had made themselves indispensable to their local communities. And I suspect that will happen in South Africa as well. The tragedy in Zimbabwe is that many white commercial farmers hadn't just lulled themselves into this false security, but also have become very arrogant in the process. They had housing conditions that were unacceptable. And that meant that when it was made a political issue by Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF, ZANU-PF often found itself pushing against an open door.
That's interesting. So what you're saying is that in South Africa, we've got this window of opportunity where commercial farmers can make themselves indispensable, really pouring themselves into the community. And that would make it difficult for populist politicians to go into that vacuum and to get the populace angry and upset about this thing, especially if they can see that these guys are really benefiting the larger community. And
look, obviously I'm being very general. For some commercial farmers in South Africa, no doubt they are battling financially, and they don't have the reserves suddenly to build nice new houses and clinics and schools. You can't apply this right across the board. But we do know that in some sectors, commercial farmers are doing very well, making substantial profits. And I'm no socialist. If you have to put me in an ideological box, I'm a classic libertarian. I believe in the free market. I believe in the necessity of title. So I'm no socialist. But I do believe that capitalists need to be strategic. And if you've got a good, profitable farm, then pour your money back into that farm, build your labor relations, build your relationship with surrounding communities, and they actually will then have a vested interest in protecting you in future.
Sure. You're quite an outspoken Christian, David. How does your faith play into what you've just said?
My faith is fundamental to my world view. And for me, when I look at Jesus, what strikes me about him was his sense of balance. He had the ability to converse with the political hierarchy and challenge them, with Pilate and the Pharisees. But he also had the common touch. He could speak to prostitutes and the destitute. And that speaks to me of someone who is balanced in his worldview. And if you apply that to politics and ideology, we can see the two extremes. We can see the extreme of communism, where the state becomes all important and we forget about individual rights. And if we go to the other extreme of extreme capitalism, individual rights become everything, and the downcast are forgotten about.
And you see Christianity as this balancing force.
And to me, Christianity is this balancing force. That the wonder about faith in Christ is that it's a personal relationship between us and the Lord Jesus. And to that extent, the individual human is critically important. But that's not where it ends. It doesn't end on the vertical. The horizontal relationship is just as important. And we are called to be salt and light in every society that we come into. And that creates an obligation on us to look beyond ourselves and to reach out to the less fortunate in our society, using the strength that we have from that vertical relationship with God to actually reach out and help people.
That's very nice. I like to think that a simplified version of communism would be to say what's yours is mine, where a Christian capitalism would be something that what's mine is yours, where there is ownership, but your relation to your property changes. I'm not sure if that is something that you are...
Well, when I look back on my Christian walk since I became a Christian in 1981, I look back and I see the Lord taking me through many trials, but in the process blessing me abundantly to such an extent that my cup at present overflows in terms of joy and blessings, in terms of my relationship with my wife and my children and everything else that the Lord has given me. But that creates obligations for me. Everything that I have, I recognize, comes from the Lord, and it is therefore not mine. And I'm a sinful human being, and I also have a Scottish background.
Oh, then you're especially sinful.
So I'm especially sinful, and my wife knows that in particular. And so I have this constant battle of, trying to protect my own property. My wife, fortunately, is not materialistic at all, and so she's a wonderful check on me and challenges me. But the one lesson I learn, and I'm still learning it, I'm a sinful human being, that we need to recognize that everything that we have has been given to us, whether it's our intellect, whether it's our job, whether it's our family, has been given to us.
Or our farm or our house.
Exactly. And it's not given to us for us to enjoy on an island in isolation. It's given to us to actually share.
Sure. So this is the first myth that your book dispels to a certain degree, but also most of your talks where you say, look, there was a disproportionate land ownership in Zimbabwe, and what happened in the 2000s didn't happen in a vacuum, and white commercial farmers actually missed an opportunity to really pour themselves in the community, and those who did that were actually protected by the community themselves. So that's maybe...
Well, not all, I need to stress. There were many outstanding commercial farmers who had fabulous housing and clinics, and because Mugabe was, driven by a political motivation, he overrode even the objections of labour and surrounding communities.
But
what I'm saying is that those who were selfish found themselves completely blown away. Those who really tried to work with local communities found that they had special protection, and in many circumstances that has enabled them to survive. I've got one particular friend who I write about in the book, a person called Peter Cunningham, who took his commercial farm and he hived off part of it and created an agricultural training institute, and has worked with people in the local communities, very poor people, who join his farm, in the Zimbabwean equivalent of homelands. And he has had to endure sustained efforts by the regime to kick him off the land. And it has been the local people who've actually stood up and said, no, you're not going to do this. And it's a particularly good example of people who've been selfless, who've developed their commercial farms. These are highly successful commercial farmers. And in the last 2 decades, he's built dams and hugely increased his arable irrigation lands. But at the same time, he's used that strength to develop an agricultural training institute called Ebenezer, which is now training up very poor people and giving them agricultural and business skills. And they are now his principal protection. And it's a very good model, I think. It won't apply to all, but it's a useful model for South Africans going forward.
Well, I think what you said here, it's not only on a pragmatic level that we need to do this. Whether this helps you in your relationship with government or not, it is the right thing to do. And some people weren't as lucky as others in that sense. So I think I hear what you're saying in that respect. Another question that I have for you is, so that's the one question. The one is, look, white people were not as innocent, and you really go into that in the atrocities committed under the Rhodesian, the Ian Smith regime, etc. But another myth that you dispel is this notion that Mugabe was this brave man who really just stood up to the imperialistic West and gave these poor, disenfranchised black Zimbabweans land. That's also a narrative that you try to dispel. Maybe just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, it comes back to that balance. It's not just an ideological balance. It's a balance when it comes to history. And Jesus, before Pilate, said, "The truth shall set you free." And it is the truth that sets any nation free. And the problem with all governments is that they tend to be subjective, and they have a distorted reality. They use propaganda to paint one version of truth. And if you look at Zimbabwe, if you speak to many white Rhodesians, they will say that the Rhodesian Front Party was very efficient and created a wonderful state, which Mugabe has destroyed, and they'll point to all the evil of Mugabe. If you speak to a ZANU-PF person, they will say that the Rhodesian Front was absolutely evil, and that everything that has gone wrong in Zimbabwe in the last 39 years has been the result of imperialism and sanctions. And the truth lies somewhere in between. In my view, as efficient as the Rhodesian state was, it was fundamentally unjust and created the circumstances for a dreadful civil war, which poisoned our entire society and which we still suffer from today. We still suffer the consequences of that dreadful war. And that's the truth about the Rhodesian era and the Rhodesian Front. It's, I believe, an objective truth. But the same applies to the last 39 years, that yes, in some respects, Mugabe he's not Satan. He's got his good and his bad sides, and he did some very good things in the first 10 years. He expanded education and made education available to all Zimbabweans, and should be commended for that. But in the same way, he was fixated by his desire to create a one-party state. And in the achievement of that goal, he utterly destroyed the principal opposition party. He was responsible for crimes against humanity, and he has developed a dreadful legacy in our country, which still continues to this day, where violence becomes the default of political parties in the resolution of problems, and is used as a means to hold on to power forever.
I want to wrap this up, David, and ask you, I think you gave a message to commercial farmers and maybe a step forward for them. What would be your message to the South African government, as they are under a lot of pressure to resolve the land issue?
Well, the principal message is, don't destroy your most important asset. We need to learn that in South Africa. Well, South Africans need to learn that what Mugabe's government did is it destroyed our principal asset by converting land into dead capital. My principal criticism of ZANU-PF is not so much that they took land from white commercial farmers. It was the manner in which they did it, the violent way, the rushed way, the unstructured way in which they did it, without training a whole new cadre of young black commercial farmers who had the agricultural skills, without creating financial packages to enable those farmers to come on, and critically, without actually giving those black farmers title. And because they haven't had title, they have not been able to develop their farms, to go to banks and to use their farms as collateral. And they've impoverished black people. And the South African government must learn that lesson.
Would you say that's Mugabe's Marxism coming through? The fact that he doesn't want to give...
It's not just Marxism. It's, in some respects, fascism.
Sure.
In that the ZANU-PF government, and it's not just Mugabe, it's Mnangagwa as well, they will not give title, because title confers power to the person who has that title. They are no longer beholden to the government. They're perhaps beholden to their banks, but the banks will protect them so long as they work hard and develop the property well. But Mugabe has not been prepared to give title, because he can use this as leverage. And we see it even in last year's election. People are threatened with the removal of their possession of land. They're told, if you vote, or if your village votes against ZANU-PF, we will evict you. And that's why they refuse to give title. So it's not just a financial issue, it's also a principal means of political control.
So the government in South Africa, you would encourage them, give title deeds to these new emerging black farmers?
Absolutely, and bring them into the financial markets. And one hears stories in South Africa now of productive commercial land being handed over and then becoming derelict. That is not good for the South African economy, and it's not good for the empowerment of black South Africans. And so before land is handed over, it's critically important that it's handed over to people who have title, but also who have the training, and that requires government input. A lot of money needs to be spent on agricultural colleges right across this nation to ensure that you've got a new, as I say, new cadre, and then they need the financial backing. But then there's also another issue that I want to touch on, and that is the expertise that cannot be trained, cannot be given, that vests in the existing block of white commercial farmers. Can you imagine this? And it's a dream. But if white commercial farmers went out and themselves identified promising black commercial farmers and brought them into their bosom, brought them into their fold, and helped them with ploughing techniques, and helped them with the maintenance of their tractors and the like, and gave them all the tips that a father will give to a son, which makes for a successful farmer, which can't be learned at an agricultural college. Now that might seem naive, it might seem a utopian ideal, but if people captured that vision right across our nation, and you built up a strong new cadre of black commercial farmers in this country that were supported by the existing white commercial farmers, they will be the people who defend title in the decades which lie ahead, because they will have a vested interest. And not only will that land remain productive, I suggest it will become even more productive in future.
David, thank you for giving us some lessons from Zimbabwe. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Can I have my tea?
Go for it. Do you want some new tea? Because that's iced tea now.
No, my wife will tell you that the one difference between me and